Okay, so like I mentioned before, our pacemaker cells of the heart have the ability to depolarize or excite themselves spontaneously. So again, no need for neural input, no need for a neurotransmitter. They can just excite themselves all on their own. So I'm going to do a little bit of a review on the action potential of skeletal muscle cells. And then after that, we will look at the action potential for cardiac muscle cells, both the pacemaker cells that are non-contractile and then the contractile cells that are doing all the pumping. So the action potential of a skeletal muscle cell, remember our resting member potential is about -70 millivolts. Then we're going to have some binding that's occurring. So we have chemically gated or ligand gated sodium channels that are going to allow for the leaking in of sodium. So this is going to happen slowly until we reach threshold. Once we reach threshold, then we're going to have a rapid depolarization. So this is called the depolarization phase. And we're going to have a rapid depolarization and a rapid influx of sodium into the cell. And when that happens, our sodium is positively charged. So if we have more positively charged ions coming into the cell is going to be more positive. And so this is going to go from this -65 or -55, depending on the source that you're looking at, but that's not really super important. It's going to increase that member potential and make it less negative or more positive up until we reach the +30 member potential. Once we reach a +30, then we're going to enter what's called the repolarization phase. And during this time, those voltage-gated sodium channels are going to close, and we're going to have voltage-gated potassium channels open. So just remember that the ones that are binding the neurotransmitter, those are chemically or ligand-gated sodium channels. Once we reach threshold, we're going to switch to voltage-gated sodium channels, and that's why we can do the rapid depolarization and the rapid influx of sodium, because these are voltage-gated, and those work much faster. So in the repolarization phase, those voltage-gated sodium channels close. We're going to have potassium channels open. And remember, when we looked at the 3 fluid compartments, potassium has a greater concentration inside the cell than outside the cell. So if you have a little bit on the inside, or sorry, a lot on the inside and a little bit on the outside, the potassium is going to want to go out. So again, if you have a lot of potassium on the inside of the cell and just a little bit of potassium on the outside of the cell, our cells always want to be in an equilibrium, so that potassium is going to move from inside the cell to out. Okay, so again, if we have a greater concentration of potassium inside the cell, a lesser concentration of potassium outside the cell, those potassium ions are going to want to move out in order to reach an equilibrium. And if you remember back at the fluid compartment diagram that we looked at during I think it was the blood lecture. I'm going back to look at it. That we looked at during the blood lecture, I believe. Yes. Remember that it's 140 for potassium on the inside of the cell and only 4 for potassium on the outside of the cell. So again, once those potassium channels open, it's going to want to move out. It is the opposite for sodium. Before we reach threshold, before we set an action potential, there's lots of sodium on the outside of the cell, less sodium on the inside of the cell, so sodium wants to go in. So you have an influx of sodium on the depolarization side and an efflux of potassium on the repolarization side. And then from there, we're going to go down past our resting membrane potential, and we're going to have what's called the refractory period. During this time, we cannot fire any more action potentials. We reestablish the membrane potential using the sodium potassium pump, and always remember the sodium potassium pump requires ATP. It uses active transport because we are creating an uneven gradient. 140 of sodium on the outside with 14 of sodium on the inside. And then for potassium is 140 on the inside and 4 on the outside. And I think it's not 14, it's 12. Let me go back and look. For blood. Yeah, it is 12. So remember, we have 140 of sodium on the outside, 12 of sodium on the inside. So sodium wants to move in during resting member potential. And then for potassium, it's 140 on the inside, 4 on the outside. So potassium wants to go out. Okay. So remember, in order to create that gradient with the 140 of sodium on the outside and 12 of sodium on the inside, and then 140 of potassium on the inside and 4 on the outside, in order to create that unevenness, to create that uneven gradient, we need to use a pump that uses active transport in order to create that uneven gradient. Because otherwise, our cells want to be in equilibrium. We want equal concentrations on either side, but we need them to be uneven to allow this movement of ions during these depolarization and repolarization phases. Okay. Alrighty. So if you need to review that stuff, please go back and review. And we're going to move on to action potentials for cardiac muscle cells. Okay, so for the action potential of a typical pacemaker cell. Now the resting membrane potential and things like that are going to be a little bit different. I'm not going to ask you what the resting membrane potential is for any of these, so you don't have to stress too much about knowing these numbers. But I'm going to put a -60 here at the bottom. It's millivolts, so never forget your units, but it's millivolts. So -60 millivolts, we'll have a -40 millivolts over here. And then here we're going to have 0 millivolts. Okay, so for a cardiac muscle cell, here's our threshold. Our threshold is around -40 for cardiac muscle cells, so a little bit different, but that's okay. So first we have what's called the pacemaker potential. So this very first little line here is called the pacemaker potential. And with the pacemaker potential, you have this slow leaking in of sodium. Right? It's happening slowly. And it's due to both the opening of sodium channels and the closing of potassium channels from the previous action potential. And so know that the action potential is never going to have a straight line. So if we go back to our action potential here, you see how we have this straight line here where we have no action potential, no excitation or depolarization of the cell. It's at that resting membrane potential and it stays flat. You're never going to see flat with the action potential of a pacemaker cell because those never stop. We have to continually excite our muscle cells, our cardiac muscle cells, so that our heart is pumping continuously all the time. So you'll never see a flat line on the action potential for a cardiac muscle pacemaker cell. So we have this pacemaker potential, which is this slow leaking in of sodium. This is very similar to the skeletal muscle where you're going to have a slow coming in of sodium until we reach threshold. That doesn't change. The only thing that's different is that this does not require a neurotransmitter. For skeletal muscle cell, it did require a neurotransmitter to open up the channel to allow for sodium to leak in. This is happening on its own through those slow calcium channels, or sorry, not slow calcium channels. This is happening slowly through the channels in the plasma membrane. Okay? And this happens slowly. This is slowly. Okay? Just like the other one, but just does not require neural input like skeletal muscle does. Then after that, after we use sodium to reach threshold, just like we did in skeletal muscle cells, we're actually going to make a switch. So instead of using sodium for that depolarization phase that happens rapidly, we're actually going to use calcium instead. Okay, so this is a big difference between skeletal muscle action potential and these pacemaker cell action potentials. So we still use the slow sodium to reach threshold, but once we reach threshold for the pacemaker cells, we're going to switch to calcium. Okay, and we're going to have a rapid influx of calcium in through voltage-gated calcium channels. And then once we reach the peak of our action potential, then those voltage-gated calcium channels are going to close, and they're going to have voltage-gated potassium channels open. This is the same as skeletal muscle cells, where you're at that peak at the top. You're going to have the channels that did the depolarization close, in this case calcium, and you're going to have potassium channels open, and you're going to have an efflux of potassium out. Okay, just like we had with skeletal muscle, because potassium is positively charged. So if your cell is losing positively charged ions, that memory potential is going to go down because you're losing positives. So you'll see as we have this efflux of potassium and potassium leaving, this memory potential is going down back towards the resting. And then once we reach the bottom, those potassium channels are going to close. Slow voltage gated sodium channels are now going to open, and the rate of sodium in serves as a timer. That's our pacemaker. However slow this sodium comes in and however slowly we reach threshold, that's going to determine how fast our heart is working. The faster the sodium comes in, the faster we reach threshold, the faster our heart is going to work and the higher our heart rate. So the pacemaking of these cells is going to be determined by how slowly the sodium leaks in. The slower the sodium comes in, the slower we reach threshold, the slower our heart is going to beat. The faster that the sodium comes in and the faster we reach threshold, the faster the heart is going to beat. Okay, and know that another big difference, which I already mentioned, between cardiac muscle and skeletal muscle cells is the fact that all of these are voltage gated, all of them. The slow sodium, the calcium, the potassium, they're all voltage gated. With skeletal muscle, again, in the beginning, we require chemically gated channels to bind a neurotransmitter to allow for the slow leaking in of sodium. Here, no, they're all voltage gated, every single one. So all ion channels are voltage gated in this case. And then also, because of the gap junctions that we have, either all the cardiac cells contract or none of them do. Okay, so we're all the cardiac muscle cells are going to contract together, or none of them are going to contract at all. It's an all or nothing thing. So all cardiac cells contract, or none do. And I'll make this smaller too, so it doesn't cover the diagram here. Okay, so all cardiac cells contract or none do, because all cells are connected by gap junctions. The exception, except neighboring, oh my gosh, I can't even spell, neighboring cells between the atria and the ventricles. Okay. So the atria and the ventricles themselves, they are not connected by gap junctions. The reason for that is because, like we said before, atria need to be able to contract downward to push the blood down into the ventricles. The ventricles need to be able to contract upward. Okay, the waves have to go upward in order for us to eject that blood up and out of the heart. Okay, so the atria and the ventricles are not connected by gap junctions, or else they would all contract downward or they would all contract upward. But we need them to be separated so that the atria can contract downward and the ventricles can contract upward. Okay, so there are cells in the middle between atria and the ventricles that do not contain gap junctions, because we need to keep the atria and the ventricles separate from each other. So again, the atria can contract downward, ventricles can contract upward. Okay. And I'll stop there for this one, and then we'll do action potential of the contractile cardiac muscle cells.